Tom, welcome.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks very much. So, and thanks again to Mark for guiding us through this maze of market access in Canada. I mean, the unpredictability of it and the lost opportunity, it really strikes me from what Mark said is, is this the best we can do in Canada? Does this really meet our highest aspirations? And as a patent attorney, I might just take a 1-minute diversion. So Mark was talking a lot about patented medicines. And the name of this, the organization is the Patented Medicine Price Review Board. And I know our visitors from overseas, Europe and the US, is probably wondering, why do we talk about it that way? Well, it's because the federal government has no jurisdiction over drugs and the pricing of drugs unless it's through the Patent Act. It's primarily a provincial responsibility here. And that's different from the US because, as you know, in the US, anything involved in interstate commerce gets federally regulated. That's how you get the FDA. And in the UK, it's a unitary, it's not a federal government, it's a unitary government. So everything can be decided by the central government in the UK. Whereas in Canada, the federal government only has jurisdiction by having patents through the patent authority. So that's why we're talking about the patented medicines in Canada. And by distinction, obviously, generic drugs don't normally have to go through the Patented Medicine Price Review Board. So that's the distinction. So to give you a further color on this, we've entitled the next panel, The Canadian Policies Impacting the Life Sciences Sector. And our 4 panelists are deeply engaged in market access for innovative medicines, and they've offered to provide their insights really more on the day-to-day functioning, on the ground perspectives of what they experience. So I am very pleased to introduce to you your moderator, Andrew Casey. Andrew has been the president and CEO of Biotech Canada since 2012. Biotech Canada, you may know, is Canada's national industry association for biotechnology, with over 200 members across Canada. Andrew is the lead spokesperson for the industry, and he's a great communicator. And with that, Andrew, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom. And now the pressure's on me, I guess, to be a great communicator. So I'll do my best. Thank you, Wendy, for the opportunity to be here today and sort of moderate this panel, which I'm looking forward to. I think the previous conversation is kind of interesting, and what we're trying to do is translate what was talked about by Mark into, I think, what's a broader implication for the ecosystem in Canada. When you look at PMPRB is part of what I would call an alphabet soup of organizations, which includes PCPA, CADTH, INES, and then, of course, the PMPRB itself. And it's a whole bunch of different ways of looking at the industry and siloing policy. And I think what we want to try and do as a panel here is explore why does this matter and what impact is it having on the advancement of innovation, not only in Canada, but I think more broadly for the world. And while I put this in context, I can ask the other panelists to come on, but if you think about the COVID-19 experience, where we were a year and a bit ago, it looked like it was fairly dire, that maybe there were going to be some therapeutics that could come along and help us out, but ultimately we're going to need vaccines. But the vaccines look like they're going to be 3 to 5 years away. And here we are in November of last year, vaccines, mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna going into the arms of Canadians and people around the world. And now, of course, more coming online. We've got Medicago sitting in the wings. They've just finished their phase 2 clinical trials with very promising data, and some other companies that are really advancing technologies. Upsell, which is developing some really cool platform technology to address COVID-19 incidents and other challenges. So lots of exciting developments have taken place since the onset of COVID. So you could make the case that biotechnology in Canada is having its moment. There's a recognition that going forward, we're going to have to prepare for future COVID-like incidents, whether it's COVID 32 or 40, pick your year, whatever. But we're going to have to get ready for the next one. We don't want to be back in the situation we found ourselves in last March. But at the same time, we're also going to have to figure out a way to rebuild the economy. As we've seen, certain sectors have been slow to rebound. And if you look at this sector throughout the pandemic, it continued to grow. You saw some fantastic deals, Notch, again, Upsell, see some really great advancements of technology. And so this is a sector that's proven that it can be actually a really important part of the economic rebuild that's going to have to take place after the pandemic's over. But it's sort of being taken in a way that you look at it and you can easily silo it. You see, get very excited about the little early stage companies and all the developments that are taking place, and sort of compartmentalize it and ignore or compartmentalize into a pricing category the multinational pharmaceutical companies. And therein lies, I think, a significant mistake for this country. It's too easy to do that way, and it ignores the important role that the pharmaceutical companies play in the ecosystem and keeping it healthy. I liken it to a coral reef. If you remove the algae from a coral reef, the coral reef will essentially die. And so you have to have all parts of your coral reef healthy if the coral reef is going to be healthy. And that's an important part. If I think about, I don't want to call, as I look at my colleagues from ABBVIE here, you're not exactly algae, but if you think about it as an ecosystem, you do represent a similar type of, you provide life to the ecosystem. And I think public policy has to address that. It has to be developed in a holistic way that understands the important role that the multinational companies play in a healthy ecosystem. So that, by way, is an introduction. So we're talking about hosting conditions and the impact hosting conditions in Canada can have on the decision making at the multinational level, but also with the companies in Canada. And so with that in mind, we've got a great panel here. Declan Hamels, who is the Vice President of Legal, Regulatory Affairs and Compliance with Innovative Medicines Canada, IMC, as many people know it. Tracy Ramsey is here, who's the Vice President and General Manager at ABBVIE Canada, and Ann Stevens, who is the Head of Business Partnering at Upsell. What I'm going to do is ask each of you to sort of lead us off with some opening remarks, and then we'll go into a fulsome discussion. I will monitor the chat room and see what sort of questions come up, and I'll try and pull some questions together and throw at the panelists. So be free to write stuff down, and I'll monitor it and throw them at the panelists as we move along. So Declan, maybe over to you to provide some opening contextual remarks, and then we'll go to Tracy and then Ann. So Declan.
Thanks, Andrew, and hello, everyone. As Andrew said, I'm Declan Hamel, Vice President at Innovative Medicines Canada. I'm pleased to be representing IMC at this important event to discuss the process, barriers, and opportunities around bringing more innovation to Canada, and more generally, to discuss some of the policies impacting the Canadian life sciences sector. By way of background, I just want to share a little bit of information about IMC. IMC consists of 47 companies from the innovative medicines and life sciences sector. We partner to champion policies that drive discovery, development, and delivery of transformative medicines and vaccines to Canadians who live longer and healthier lives. Our objective is to accelerate discovery, development, manufacture, and delivery of new medicines and vaccines. As everyone knows, COVID-19 has shone a bright spotlight on the life sciences. The pandemic has highlighted what is possible through increased collaboration within Canada's health system stakeholders. But it's also magnified areas where Canada has, respectfully, some room for improvement. Due to the pandemic, countries all around the world have recognized the contribution of a strong life sciences sector to their health and well-being of their citizens and their economy. Canada is no different in that regard. Unfortunately, years of public policy decisions by governments of all stripe, Liberal, Conservative, provincial, federal, have made Canada a less attractive place for industry investment and commercial activity. It's not to say that there hasn't been any investment. That would be an overstatement, but rather just as a G7 nation, we're capable of so much more. This is the time, given the crisis, to try and focus on a path forward. And the burning question is, how can we effectively do this together? There's two shared concepts that I'd like to introduce, both of which are very simple to say and extremely difficult to implement in practice, given the federal nature of our country. But we need a commitment to work together, and we need a comprehensive strategy. On the first point, we need to agree that the model of collaboration with the federal government during COVID-19 should become the standard operating procedure. We've seen incredible collaboration between the industry, between government, the healthcare system, other stakeholders. Just to be clear, this doesn't mean that we're always going to agree with government and vice versa. That's highly unlikely to happen. But what it does mean is there should be meaningful consultation before policies and regulations are put in place, and due consideration given to the views of industry and other stakeholders. The second thing is we need a comprehensive strategy. The recent Health and Biosciences Economic Strategy Report sometimes called the HBEST report, would be a good place to start. As the HBEST report noted, a holistic approach to Canada's policy and regulatory environment is essential. There's been some progress, and we need to give credit where credit is due. Health Canada's interim order regulatory efficiency measures have helped to accelerate COVID medicine and vaccine regulatory approvals. And we support the integration of these efficiencies into Health Canada's standard processes after the pandemic. In addition to that, the recent federal budget has reaffirmed the government's commitment to create a program for drugs for rare diseases. Canada is the only developed country with no rare disease framework, and we need to address this long-standing policy gap as soon as possible with an effective rare disease program. But the holistic approach that I mentioned, unfortunately, remains elusive. As Mark Legault noted in the previous session, the PNPRB changes are scheduled to be implemented on July 1st, and they propose significant challenges for our members. The changes will impact global decision-making processes about the Canadian market. They'll delay new medicine launches here, and they complicate our members' ability to invest in the country. And that will impact everything from clinical trials, research partnerships, and support for patient programs. The changes are going ahead despite the overwhelming majority of the responses to multiple Health Canada and PNPRB consultation processes over a multi-year period that were not in support of the changes. The record is very clear. Industry and other stakeholders were resolutely opposed to these changes. And moreover, we offered an alternative, which we thought was a more balanced and I guess more reasonable approach, certainly simpler, that would save costs of the healthcare system and also include an investment commitment for the life sciences sector. Nevertheless, we see an opportunity in Canada with stronger government collaboration. We recently put forward the proposal to build a world-class life sciences sector in Canada. By working together, we can build a life sciences ecosystem that will protect Canadian patients' access to the newest and most innovative medicines, that will offer investment in Canada, foster innovation, and contribute to a more robust domestic manufacturing capacity. However, all stakeholders involved must first recognize the need for a strong life sciences sector and the importance of creating policies and a regulatory and policy environment that supports innovation and attracts research and development. In order to achieve that, we need to work strategically on a whole of federal government integrated approach on a path forward. There are models that can be considered in other jurisdictions. Denmark and the UK are two examples of strategic national approaches to their respective life sciences sectors. But we need to move quickly. The pandemic has graphically demonstrated the importance of the life sciences to countries all around the world. And most of them are trying to grow their respective sectors too. So the competition we face is real and it's intense, but we do have definite strengths upon which to build. So with that thought, I'll wrap up by highlighting what I think is the immense opportunity before us to increase the levels of cooperation and to have a strategic and holistic life sciences strategy with industry, other stakeholders, and the federal government. Success will yield important benefits for our health systems and for our economy. And at the end of the day, it's important to remember that we all have a shared goal of improving the health and well-being of Canadians, and a comprehensive and holistic federal approach to the life sciences will help to advance that common objective. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks, Declan, and now I'll pass it over to Tracy.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon and good morning for those of you in the West. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for Life Sciences BC for putting this event on. For those of you who don't know ABBVIE, ABBVIE is a research-based biopharmaceutical company. It's a global organization, and to give you a sense of our footprint, we've got about 47,000 employees around the world, and just under about 1,000 here in Canada. And with that footprint in Canada, we actually serve about 1 million Canadians who benefit from our products every year. So science and innovation is really at the core of what we is our vision and our mission, and our goal is to really make a difference efforts for those most challenging unmet medical needs, both here for Canadians, but around the world. To give you a sense of the areas we operate is very diverse in terms of where we work with Canadian unmet needs, from oncology to immunology, so diseases like Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis as an example, as well as we've got products that help people with glaucoma and eye care, as well as neurosciences, so thinking about that patient with chronic migraine. And so we really believe that having an innovative-based life sciences sector here in Canada really can bring value. It can bring value to patients. When you think about that patient who is now refractory on their medicine, let's say that irritable bowel disease patient, they're really looking for a new innovative option that's going to allow them to manage their family and get back to work, as well as for a robust life sciences economy, because we believe we play also a role in supporting the health of innovation in Canada, and we see that in terms of the government's interest certainly to do that. And perhaps I could just make a general comment to the comments by Andrew is completely agree with the opportunity and the importance of looking at life sciences sector and bringing innovation to patients as an ecosystem. My observation is that if we're not looking across the continuum of care, both from the bench to approval all the way to reimbursement and access and into the hands of patients, we're not going to be able to help the health of Canadians moving forward. When you look at the examples, right, as Mark set out, one of the things that struck me is that there are parts of our continuum that are extremely predictable and timely. And I just have to say, to the example of the vaccines efforts to have those approved, when you look at Health Canada and their role in that continuum as that first step, they are extremely clear in the criteria from a safety, from a data perspective of what it would take to approve a product to launch it here in Canada and bring it to patients. They're extremely clear on their timelines about the time period and the process that they use. And they actually have adapted themselves over time in terms of meeting the needs of a changing healthcare landscape. Examples are they now will welcome and use real world evidence. Another example is they have accelerated reviews for some innovative products when the science and the clinical benefit is clear, and they will really accelerate making sure that those products come here to Canada. The observation, though, when you step past that into the reimbursement and access and pricing landscape is where that complexity really is enhanced. And when you look at the comments from Mark, what we're starting to see is a convergence or overlapping or duplication of specific elements within that process. And so when you look at reference-based pricing, which we've had in Canada, as he mentioned, for years, it historically was very predictable. You knew the methodology from PMPRB, and you were able to plan as an organization and predict and take that forward as you look at health economic impact. Our CADTH reviews are really about to the question is how do we look at price? Well, really, from my perspective, price is the start. After approval is one piece of the pie. What we really focus on is cost effectiveness. What we really are focused on is value, and what is the value not just to patients but to the healthcare ecosystem. And so when we think about the role of PMPRB as an example, stepping into health technology assessments, which is an area that is already covered, and we have great history with CADTH and INESS, it starts to muddy the waters, and it muddies the waters because the criteria within PMPRB are not clear. When you look at the CADTH process, again, it's not, we don't always agree, but the process and the framework, right, is one that is more well known. I would then transition to a comment about timing. because to my example of Health Canada, very clear timeline. So for an organization like ABBVIE, it really helps us predict and plan our global resources, our local resources, and how we bring a new innovative product to Canada. And when you start to step into CADIS, the HTA reviews, when you start to step into what's called that, pricing negotiation, PCPA, that represents the provinces, what we see is increasing unpredictability in terms of time to review, time to listing, and even the predictability of when those products might be available within any specific province. So my comment is, I think that we can take a page out of the incredible work that was done in the back of the pandemic, seeing the great predictiveness and timeliness of the way that drugs are approved in Canada, and take a lesson to say, how can we apply that across that continuum, and especially when we see how we rank relative to other OECD countries. And if we think about our time to access relative to the top 20 OECD, we're way below the mean, 9 months in terms of averages based on the last data that we've seen. And so the question is for that patient who's looking for that next innovation, do we have a system that is really predictable and timely, that allows us to operate to get them the value in the drugs they need. So thank you. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tracy. And Anne?
Great, thank you. And again, first of all, thank you for having me here today. I'm very happy to be part of this panel, and thank you to Life Sciences BC for bringing together the community to discuss such an important and timely topic. My name is Anne Stevens. I'm currently the head of business partnering at Upsell, a technology company based here in Vancouver, focused on next generation antibody discovery. Our platform was most recently featured for the discovery that was done recently at an unprecedented pace for the first FDA-approved antibody for COVID-19, which was advanced and brought to market through our partnership with Eli Lilly. I just want to say, as part of the opening remark too, that excuse me, that I think we're all here with a similar vision, to have the best therapies available and accessible to Canadians as and when they may be needed. But my focus and my background is really looking at it across the continuum, basically, and looking at it in the way that it starts with innovation. And Canada has been on the world stage recently for its contributions and innovations around rapidly emerging technologies, those incorporated into vaccines and the discovery of treatments for COVID-19. But Canadian researchers have been playing a very significant role in advancing global research and development beyond COVID. And this has been really a direct result of collaboration. And that, I think, is a really key piece that we need to focus on, in the later parts of commercialization as well. Collaboration between government, industry, innovators, academia, and practitioners. So going all the way from bench to patient and understanding the pressures along the way. Excuse me. We, as Canadians, I think we need to always be working together on policy changes to address areas where we can do better to ensure Canadians have access to the best therapies around the world in a timely fashion. But to do it in a way that is avoiding any unintended consequences, or at least being aware of those potentially unintended consequences, and avoid them as much as possible that could come from those policy changes, not only impacting accessibility of new and needed therapies, but also impacting our life sciences sector here in Canada. I'll just touch briefly on the potential impacts of PNPRB on the bioeconomy, because I think it is important to take a step back and see that this is not just impacting multinational organizations, but it's also impacting the small and emerging biotech companies in Canada that are contributing to advancing next generation technologies. When Canada is viewed as an approachable market on the global scale, industry partners are present and their investments are felt in our centers of excellence, our accelerators, our incubators, the size and number of clinical trial sites in Canada, and in patient support programs. The the topic of the discussion this morning so far around the proposed changes by the PMPRB for pricing, providing a level of uncertainty and unpredictability, it's adding to challenges that would potentially deprioritize Canada as a country to launch novel products in. And this risk, the risk of this continuing could ultimately impact the investment level made by industry partners, which ultimately can impact the bioeconomy that we have here. So that's just something to think, to keep in mind and to think about as we start this discussion. But I'll pass it back over to Andrew.
Thank you, Anne, Tracy, and Declan. Some great stuff there. So as I said, I will continue to monitor the question box and see if I can thread together some questions if they pop up, but we'll sort of begin a bit of a discussion. And maybe one of the things that, as Declan was speaking, you mentioned Denmark and the UK. I mean, the grass always seems like it's greener on the other side, right? So, and I've been around a number of tables with my colleagues from other associations around the world over the years, and they always think that every other jurisdiction has it better. So, but let's maybe unbundle that a bit. And as an example, which I think is an important one, this year, insulin is, the discovery of insulin is celebrating its 100th anniversary. Of course, it is the bedrock of a company called Novo Nordisk, which is now based in Denmark. I would argue that if we done it properly back then, we should have whatever would be Canada Disc or Novo Canada. I don't know what it would be, but whatever version of Novo Nordisk should be a Canadian company. It is not. So how do we ensure that an Upsell becomes a Canadian anchor company? And I don't want to put this to Anne because I think it's unfair to you, but as you know, Declan, you mentioned that other jurisdictions are doing it well. Tracy, you've got experience with ABBVIE from global operations that are seeing other jurisdictions. And you talked a bit about, you know, Canada is essentially competing with other jurisdictions to attract investors and partners, and we have to be as hospitable as possible and to be seen to be a market that is open. So what do we need to do differently? I mean, like, it's holistic policy are words that I've heard everybody kind of talk about. What does that exactly mean? Let's get a little tactile on that, because I think that we're at an important point here. I can call on any one of you. I feel like a teacher.
And do you want to start and I'll jump in?
Tracy, go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So to the question is, the great thing, and Anne mentioned, is we've got a very, I'm going to say, attractive Canadian landscape when we look at research facilities, institutions, leading external experts, clinicians, sites for research and development. And so from that perspective, the question is, how do we put that into the context of a broader capability in Canada? So it's one thing to say we're going to bring research dollars here, but if the I'm going to say if the landscape doesn't support that particular asset also being accepted by Canadians and moving through, it does limit the research lens. So I'll just make an example. There's certain research we all know that's done in the pre-approval phase, but there's also significant research and key clinical questions that we continue to ask once new innovative medicines are brought to Canada, whether that's in terms of patient outcomes, analyzing real world evidence. And so if we're looking only at the development to approval part of the research landscape, I think we're being narrow in really understanding the full continuum of where Canada can play in life sciences to do that. And the reason I mention that is if you've got an acre company here that is looking not just at bringing new products, but then allowing those other, I'm going to say, continuum of research, development, partnerships, insights, then that's where we can start exporting that to other markets. So I think that would be my comment.
Yeah, and I would add to that. So you know, I think there's a lot of unpacking to do in the question that you asked, Andrew. I think there's a lot of complexities to keeping innovative companies here as anchor companies in Canada, and it starts with policies very early on in terms of you know, tax incentive policies for innovation focused companies, and all the way through the spectrum. And I think it's important to think of all of the stakeholders along the way and to really collaborate together from the inception of innovation, understanding the pressures that the next stakeholder would feel and incorporating those into the thinking and policy making as well. I think the pricing component that we've been talking about is certainly an important one that impacts a number of different stakeholders, and access to therapies ultimately potentially could have trickle-down effects into the level of investment that's made into some of these companies. But we're seeing more and more companies in Canada mature to a point where they are currently our anchor companies. Upsell is an example of that. Aurinia is another great example. We have Medicago in Quebec as well. Repair Therapeutics right on its heels. I think those companies, need to be incentivized to stay here. And I think it is interesting to watch and to learn from how they're approaching commercialization and where Canada fits into their launch sequence. Of course, they shouldn't be prioritizing Canada, solely because of geography, but from a shareholder's perspective. But at the same time, it should be an accessible market for them, especially when the innovation is born here in Canada. And I think that's something that we need to be very thoughtful about.
Any thoughts?
So I agree with everything that Tracy and Anne said. And it is a very broad question. There's many things that could be said. I'd start off with a very basic principle, which is don't introduce pricing regulatory changes that extremely sophisticated multinational companies can't figure out. As you heard from Mark, companies, even ones which have, resources and specialized expertise, can understand their pricing structure. And while that goes on, it's going to be difficult to convince them that Canada is a great place to invest and do business. So, rule number one is do no harm. However, beyond that, I think there's a need for a change in mindset. And sometimes it starts with very simple things. If you look at Health Canada's mission statement and its values, there's absolutely no reference to promoting innovation or to enhancing the life sciences sector. If you look at the FDA's mission statement, it explicitly calls out the need to have a speedy access to innovative products for patients. And I believe Denmark's medicines agency explicitly says part of our job is to make Denmark a life sciences leader. And so, we need to change our mindset here. The two are not incompatible. We tend to view these things as being separate, but there is a reimbursement, HTA, gatekeeping function, a regulatory function, and then there's, economic development agencies and ministries, and they're responsible for attracting investment. Everybody's job should be to enhance the life sciences sector, and there's no contradiction between that and having proper regulatory mechanisms. Canada is a bit of a challenge because of the federal nature of the country. It doesn't make things easier. And sometimes it's easy to look at a nice, compact, unitary state like Denmark. It's a lot easier for them to get their ducks in a row. The UK is a little bit more complex, but nevertheless, same principle. However, these things can be overcome. These are not insurmountable obstacles if everybody agrees on the objective. If people don't agree on the objective, then we're not going to succeed.
Okay, so I'm going to try and be a little provocative here too, because as I see in the question, there's an interesting question, which is there's no counterweight to the three of you on the other side saying, well, this is why PMP are being important. So I'm going to try and be that, even though I must admit I come with a bias. So, and that would be that I'm not really supportive of the changes, but I'll try and do it anyways. And maybe Tracy, I'll start with you and then add to you as well, because you can come at this question from two different angles. By all accounts, the Canadian marketplace is about 2% of the global marketplace for the pharma industry, right? So with all this complexity and issues and stuff, why is this important to ABBVIE? Like, why do you even care? You've got patients here and stuff, so but this should be kind of a rounding error. So I'll poke you that way. And then Anne, you kind of brought it up in your answer to the last question, which is, realistically, Upsell, Repair, Arinia, you're all developing products for the global marketplace, primarily the US marketplace, right? And then the European, and then Canada becomes at some point an afterthought. So how does this all play into your thinking as a company as you become more global in nature, and sort of what are the implications of a relatively hostile environment from a pricing reimbursement standpoint for you and your decision making? So maybe I'll start with Tracy, and then Declan, you can cover it more broadly, as you understand all the members of IMC. So, but Tracy, maybe from your perspective at ABBVIE.
So, starting with a lens as a global company, right? Our mission is really clear in terms of making a remarkable impact on patient lives. And I know that, stating mission statements can sound hollow, but when you take that from a perspective of why does it matter in Canada, right? Canada is a significant, I'm going to say, market in terms of OECD countries. We're a developed market in the context of a sophisticated healthcare system. We believe that Canadians should have access to the same innovative products as Europeans and as the US as an example. And so when you take that as a landscape, the question is, what does it take to bring these innovations to Canada, and are we effective in bringing them to Canada relative to other markets? And I would say right now that the predictability and the timeliness is stepping Canada behind other European countries. So what that means is that when I'm having discussions within ABBVIE and we're trying to understand how do we plan, how do we resource, how do we invest, how do we have research that's going to support what we believe are innovative global products? The question becomes, where does Canada fit in? And Canada historically had, because of the predictability in price and because of the predictability of access, was something that we could plan for. Right now, what we're finding is we have Plan A, but Plan A is constantly changing. And as you know, biopharmaceutical and life sciences industry is a long-term proposition, right? We look at the long-term view in the way that we look at developing products, because it takes 10 years. But we also look at the long-term view once those products are ready for approval and commercialization and bringing them to patients. So from that perspective, why it matters is because from an equity perspective, the question is, why shouldn't Canadians have access? It also matters in terms of what it means to other countries. From a pricing perspective, Canada is sometimes a reference country for other countries. We know that regulators share files. We've got collaborations with the FDA, with the UK as an example. We have collaborations on health technology assessments. And so it's really a flat world. And so when you start to look at the implications of how this, I'm going to say, complex, non-clear, it not only matters in Canada, but it could have ripples in terms of what this means in terms of other jurisdictions, and so that's why it matters. And it's a complex issue, but I would say that's to say that Canada doesn't matter and Canadians don't matter, I don't think is the framework. I think the framework is more about how can you turn that around and say, do we want to matter? Do we want to be on the world stage? Do we want to have a viable life sciences sector and bring innovations to Canadians? So what would that take? And again, in a cost-effective way, with a commitment to being both responsible in terms of outcomes, but also being responsible in terms of economic benefit for the economy.
And just before I pass it to Anne, the other part that I think is important, right, is the clinical trials and decisions around where to put clinical trials. And if you're commercially active in the marketplace, does that not factor into your decision making as a global operation?
Well, as I mentioned, people sometimes think about clinical trial development just as the early stages, right? Versus clinical research and development is a continuum. It's a continuum because, as you know, we have registration trials, but they answer the basics in terms of clinical effectiveness and safety. There's many more questions in terms of best patient outcomes that we need to. So whether it's on the front end, certainly looking at markets, but I would say as importantly, from my perspective, if we're really focused on outcomes and strong cost effectiveness measures, that research would follow the countries that have those products available to their population.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. And from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think just to sort of preface the response here, so Upsellera, from kind of the Upsellera perspective, the focus of Upsellera is really in partnerships. We have a platform technology and enable partners to advance their therapeutics, and so the commercial party is really not Upsellera. That said, when we see the discoveries that are made in-house and here in Canada, such as bamlanivimab, and see it being successfully used in other jurisdictions and having encountered barriers in the Canadian context, it does provide an emotive response. As a Canadian company and creating innovation here, you ultimately want to see it benefiting Canadian patients as well. So I think the example of bamlanivimab in particular is actually interesting in this discussion because it was not an issue around price. I think a very unique circumstance, but where things really encountered barriers to access was at the provincial level. So, I think this goes back to the concept of thinking about all stakeholders involved in the discovery, development, and ultimately the launch process of where the pressure points are and how to work together to make sure that those are being solved along the way. And the logistical rollout component is a big part of that as well.
Of course, in BC, you have the Visudyne QLT experience, which is not too far back in people's memories, and now Aurinia is got FDA approval, so it's only a matter of time before they start to look at the different launchings as well. So, I mean, it's interesting. As was noted in my intro, but I've been here for 9 years, and 5 years or so ago, the Canadian marketplace was never talked about by the early stage companies, and now it's becoming increasingly important part of the strategic plan because, as you point out, Anne, any of these platform technologies are only viable in terms of a partnership with a globally commercial company, in which Canada is an important marketplace. So there is this now increasing link between all that. And Declan, the other part that I know that IMC has talked a lot about is the sort of first tier launch. So the Canadian marketplace is very important for a lot of companies. And so some of this uncertainty and complexity that everybody talked about is having an impact on those decisions, right? I mean, you guys have sort of been very vocal on that.
Yeah, and thanks, Andrew. And I take the point of the questioner, like that, we're all quite aligned on the panel. We all have our inherent perspectives or biases, but I would say two things. First of all, I've never heard a member of IMC say, Canada's not an important market. Like, we can take it or leave it. We are an important market. We're a G7 nation. And as Tracy said, what happens here also has impacts on pricing in other nations. So Canada is important. The second thing I would say, maybe more importantly, is that throughout the whole PMPRB, the multi-year drama that we've been going through, I've never heard a member say, we're not conscious of cost realities and the budget realities that Canadian governments are facing. No one has said, we're fighting for the status quo here, and there's no problem. Rather, the approach has been, how can we help you solve the problem, Canadian governments, while at the same time having a system which encourages product introductions here, which encourages R&D, clinical trials, etc. So, I don't have firsthand experience like Anne or Tracy, but I can say the members are pretty aligned that they want to be pragmatic in terms of solutions. Where PMPRB is really an interesting made in Canada kind of creature is that, yes, it's true that PCPA and provincial payers, private payers as well, all have cost, containment motivations. They also have access responsibilities. The drug plan in BC has responsibilities for the citizens of British Columbia, Quebec, Ontario, wherever you go. PMPRB is a strange Canadian phenomenon because it disconnects the cost issue from access. PMPRB has stated repeatedly that access is not their issue. Promoting innovation is not really their issue. They're basically about cost containment. And I think that's why they're a particular issue. And to the extent that there's something which sticks out for international companies looking at Canada, it is that this is a bit of an idiosyncratic phenomenon, and not in a good way. It's something that they have a hard time understanding. They do business with governments all around the world who have budgets. The budgets are under stress. After the pandemic, they'll be under even more stress because of the increase in debt to GDP ratios, and companies can work through that. But this particular Canadian phenomenon is a bit of a negative market differentiator, and it doesn't help keep Canada in that kind of tier one launch status.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you've got when you move away from a non-holistic, if that's a word, way of doing policy, it's very easy to sort of look at this just through a pricing lens, right? And in which case you're just saying, well, you're big bad pharma, your prices are too high, and so we're going to do everything we can to drive prices down and not think about all the consequences that happen out, which is where you get this impact on the ecosystem and on patients, right? The access for patients, and then of course the investment and partnership that we're talking about also gets equally impacted. And the problem we have as an industry is it's an easy target, right? Because it's a line item in a budget. You cut it by X%, you get X% savings right away in that fiscal year. Whereas if you go after other costs in the healthcare system, like doctors and nurses and administration and procurement, it takes forever for those savings to be realized. And politically, no politician is going to get challenged for taking on big bad pharma. So it all sort of fits into a nice little box, and it's easy to do, but only if you choose to ignore all the other implications. Now, I want to sort of maybe shift slightly because this is really focused on pricing and reimbursement. There's other components that go into affecting the way companies make decisions to stay in Canada, to invest in Canada, to act in Canada. One of the important ones is the regulatory system. So aside from pricing and reimbursement, we have an important role here to sort of approve drugs for safety and efficacy and get them into the patients. The industry is evolving rapidly, where technologies that were simple, non-complex drugs, simple molecules earlier, now we're getting into platform technologies, we're moving into gene therapies, other sorts of really phenomenal game-changing technologies. How are we doing as a country from a regulatory standpoint, keeping pace with those and making sure that we're not, I think it was Anne that said that we're falling behind other countries. Are we keeping pace with other countries from a regulatory standpoint? And maybe I'll start, Anne, you're now starting to explore all this stuff and seeing it probably from your angle. What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Well, I think back to kind of my last role in my career, where I was in a position of looking at importing differentiated products into Canada through in-licensing. And at the time, regulatory was a really a big burden to tackle the Canadian market. And I would say that in recent years, I think they've come a long way in terms of defining pathways and having more streamlined approaches where potentially didn't exist previously. So I think there's obviously still room for improvement, especially like you said, with some of these newer technologies, particularly in areas where they've implemented special access programs that are very temporary band-aid solution, but are, I think, maybe overutilized a little bit in lieu of a more formal pathway that could exist. So I think, I think it's certainly an important piece of the puzzle to be considering ways to innovate that as well.
Andrew, maybe just a lens to this question, a slightly different view. And again, I'm not a regulatory expert, but my observation is the Health Canada in their, I'm going to say, growing understanding that the world is changing, appears to have a very partnership approach, right? And I think it goes back to Declan's comment, right? If we think about when you're open to dialogue, understanding other perspectives, and that for Health Canada I've seen include in terms of the capacity to bring in external experts, their willingness to work across borders when they're looking at new novel therapies and filing, and the willingness to share in terms of those platforms. And so by opening it up, I think it has also helped them think about new ways of working. And again, this isn't, I'll use the real world evidence platform. Real world evidence for a time was not accepted by Health Canada as a reliable quality data source. That has now changed. They have a mechanism to look around the world to real world evidence in the context of existing products to bring that to bear for approval of new indications. So when we're in new spaces, the ability to look outside in is really important. And if we think about our reimbursement and access lens, and I think Declan and certainly Mark said it's the dialogue and an understanding of what are the implications, what are our options to solve this, not because our heads in the sand to the challenges of fiscal challenges, especially on the back of the pandemic, but because there's expertise that would allow for us to move forward together. So that's just a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, as you know, Biotech Canada's got a biologics regulatory advisory group, which is a collection of our experts in the companies of the biologics, and they have regular meetings with the Health Canada Biologics Directorate to have those conversations, right? What's coming? What do we need to know as regulators? And then the regulators back to the companies, here's what we're struggling with. So it is a dialogue, it's a frank and open exchange, and I think that really does help regulatory efficiency. Declan, any thoughts on this one?
No, I mean, as I said before, I think members have been pleased by Health Canada's, nimbleness in the context of the pandemic, and Health Canada has recognized that they're probably not going to go back to the way that they did things before. So they're trying to kind of make some of these interim arrangements permanent in their regulations. I think in addition to the actual regulations and guidelines, as you alluded to, Andrew, there is also a good appetite, on the part of Health Canada for dialogue. They want to sit down with companies, understand how these products work, and that's very important. So I think in our continuum, we'd have to say that there are many different issues and nothing is perfect, but the Health Canada regulatory process at the moment, is even pre-pandemic. One can argue that by international standards, it was pretty good, and I think it is improving. However, and I think this is a point that Tracy made earlier, at the end of the day, it might be for naught. If you still get caught up later in the access continuum and you're stranded in PCPA negotiations, which are going nowhere, and then you get to the provinces, and after that, they may or may not list your product, so it may or may not be available to patients in a given the problem is a bit further downstream. That's what most of our members have told us.
Sense. I've been given the blessing to go 5 minutes over, so if it's all right with you guys, we can go for another 10 minutes. So I have two questions, and one I'm going to pick up on. Taryn Gray's asked a question down below, which I think is back to me being the agitator here. So let me ask you this. We're always very good, like any industry, we're very good at telling government what they're doing wrong. And what if we were to flip it around and say to ourselves, what do we need to do better as an industry to, in this scenario, talking about making sure that Canada is a better environment for the industry, but are there things that we as an industry can do to improve? I won't pick on anybody, so whoever wants to volunteer for that one.
Maybe I'll start off with that one. I think one of the key things here is, we've talked a lot about collaboration and we've talked a lot about different stakeholders, but I think truly coming together and understanding, where our respective pressure points are is incredibly important. I think translating value is what we can do better, and not so much focus on the price or dollar cost, but really understanding how that translates into value for patients, for the healthcare system in general, for providers, for caregivers. You know, that is, and then translating that into, you know, what the actual value is of the innovation that comes behind that. And that's an aspect that I think we could probably do a better job of communicating to make sure that that ultimately, you know, I think we're all wanting to move forward with the same goal in mind of improving access and getting, you know, access to novel therapies as quickly as possible. And, you know, on the opposite end of that, we need to be understanding government pressures as well in terms of their budgets and where those concerns are coming from. And again, I think it does come down to a value conversation.
Yeah, walk a mile in their shoes and figure out what they're going through. But the other part, of course, is I think and maybe this is to the more holistic discussion, is collectively we have to come up with a definition of what value is. You know, I think value is evolving just as the products are, and the patient care is evolving. And so I think coming to some agreement as to what the value is and where the different values. So the old model of, well, it keeps the person out of a hospital bed, that's not a value point anymore, right? You're talking about better lifestyles, a better parent, a better worker. There's all sorts of other value equations that need to be brought into the discussion for sure. Tracy?
Yeah, and I think I couldn't agree more in terms of spending more time, and I think we can do a better job, to your point, really communicating and articulating and understanding what the value looks like for government. I think at least at ABBVIE, we try to really understand the value for patients before we even start the development of a drug, right, with the end in mind. But given the governments, and so it's just as an example, you know, some of the things that are innovative, I'm going to say cost sharing mechanisms, right, in terms of patient outcome-based agreements. They require more complexity in working with government, but they certainly reinforce, right, the value proposition of a particular new innovative medicine in its role in therapy. And so I think that there's an opportunity for us to openly dialogue about those types of endpoints, how we can come to that perspective, and to Anne's point, do it with full recognition of what the government is trying to solve for. An example of that is, you know, we see innovative medicines coming out with fixed term treatments, right? So chronic diseases that now can, you know, progress-free survival or eradicate disease over a shorter period of time. And so when we're having discussions with government, because it's typically a budget discussion as opposed to an economic and a health, you know, an impact of the broader context, help understand, well, how can we manage that, right? In terms of the way that you manage fiscally, the way you operate within the healthcare system. So I think we can do a better job connecting the dots and bringing our value and actually providing innovative options for them. In the same way, the example of the regulatory, you know, I feel that there's been a role for industry to provide options for Health Canada of ways to find solutions that benefit both stakeholders. And I think we could do a better job making that clear.
Yeah, that openness to being more creative around how we do price and reimbursement, new models, new measurements, that's all critical. Declan?
I think one thing we could do a bit better is we should be more proactive in our approaches. I think there's a certain amount of cynicism in governments, federal and provincial, that the industry, you know, starts talking about alternatives and innovative solutions once, you know, they're faced with policies, laws, or regulations that they don't like, and that in turn, you know, kind of makes you look like you're foot dragging, and you're not really sincere about this. That it's really just playing for time or trying to reverse policies that you don't like. I think the industry needs to do a better job of getting out there and being proactive and talking to governments about their issues before there is a policy that they don't like for whatever reason. And in addition to that, to enhance the credibility of the industry, we need to start talking about issues that may not be top of mind for government, but there will be issues. I think the international industry has a really good initiative going on right now in the context of antimicrobial resistance, AMR, which is really not on a lot of radar screens in Canada. Understandably so. We've got a pandemic going on. We're preoccupied, but I think there's an opportunity for industry to demonstrate value by maybe spending time talking to decision makers and officials and policy makers about issues other than the kind of guns and butter issues that are kind of usually top of mind, and where the industry often seems to be playing defense and essentially obstructing policy objectives. So I think it's just kind of a mix of being more proactive, but also becoming more of a trusted source of information by addressing issues proactively, which before they become raging fires.
Right. You don't always want to be calling the fire department. Sometimes it's better off to be well in advance of that, right? For sure. And just maybe one final question. I think, Anne, you're probably the best position to do, and it may require you taking off your particular Upseller hat, but leaning more on your past experience and maybe part of your role, because you have to imagine a place where Upseller is not publicly listed right now with all of its market capitalization. But what sort of impact does this have on emerging companies as they come out and start to look at the marketplace and looking for investment and their ability to attract investment? What these types of decisions seem to be far removed, but I mean, my take is they're not. I'd love to hear what your perspectives are.
Well, I think, like you pointed out, when an emerging company is developing an asset internally, the primary market that they're focused on is not necessarily Canada. So I think some of these, kind of pricing conversations and access conversations are not directly linked to investments in early stage companies from that side. I think it's the broader sense of, are we making sure that we're building, the companies in a way that is, most efficient. And I think that goes back to an earlier comment that we need to think about policies across the whole spectrum. And, it's those policies around really enabling tax efficiencies or incentives for companies to stay here in Canada and grow here. And that translating to more of a fiscal responsibility of companies to be in a country that supports that growth. So I think, again, it's all part of the same policy conversation, but just a different side of it that probably would have more of an impact on direct investments from an investor, an external investor for those emerging companies. Yeah. That said, though, I will say that there is the other component of partnerships and just visibility on our ecosystem when there is a presence here by those multinational companies that ultimately will be partners and could help advance companies and attract secondary investments by third parties. So it is intertwined. I think it's just a different perspective.
All right. That makes total sense to me. So I think I'll just kind of wrap it up and conclude that. And I think what I heard from everybody is we've got a fantastic ecosystem. It's doing remarkable work from lab right out to the bedside. But if we really want to take this to the next level and create anchor companies in this country and grow the industry, we really have to take a more holistic approach to this. Unpredictability and uncertainty are killers there. And so we have to remove some of that and take advantage of the fact that there's enormous opportunity to work with the industry to really create a much more fertile environment if we are able to get rid of that uncertainty and unpredictability. So thank you, Anne, Tracy, and Declan. And my instructions are now to hand it back to Wendy and move on to the next phase. Thank you all.
Sorry, thank you very much, Andrew. Excellent moderating. Thank you, Tracy, Declan, and Anne. It was a great discussion, one that, could go on for a lot longer than just the time we allotted to it. I think one of the themes in addition to to Andrew's summary is that, and I think Tracy, you commented on it as well, is the collaboration, between the health system, whether they're regulators or whomever, as well as industry, small, large, and then venture capital, whoever. We have a very, the life sciences sector is a really exciting sector. There's lots of innovation going on. But in order to bring things forward, it really is us all working together and playing our respective roles. And sometimes, as one of you said, walk in the other party's shoes. Because this is complex and challenging, whichever area of the stakeholder group you sit in. Yet, there's a lot of dedicated, smart, professional people that dedicate their life to advancing science for the benefit of patient outcomes, so that we can all live productive lives wherever we happen to sit and whatever stakeholder group we represent. So I applaud all of you for putting yourself forward. These discussions can sometimes be really polarizing. So Andrew, a great job in moderating it, in trying to walk on both sides of the fence, so to speak, and look forward to future discussions. What we're going to do now is take a bit of a break, and then we're going to hop across the virtual pond over to the UK and get the opportunity to learn a little bit about the UK life sciences strategy and what are some of those elements of it that we might want to consider as we move forward in Canada. Thank you again very much. And so in about 8 minutes, we'll be back.